Welcome to the Unlist. Today we are talking about Calvin Klein. Ah, yes, Calvin Klein. The designer fragrance house that most people in the online fragrance community seem to love hating. Yeah, I know, those are fighting words. Y'all are going to box me up in the comment section now. You're going to Liam Neeson my ass and take me out. You're going to find me, and then you're going to do things to me. I get it. That's how this community is. We all have peanut brittle when it comes to egos, very easily shattered. And we're a little nuts too, so that metaphor also applies. But it's true. It is 100% true. Of all the designer brands I see get bashed, trash talked, shade thrown on them, Calvin Klein is up there at the top, you know. For all the hate people dump on individual fragrances like Sauvage, like Invictus, the brands Dior and Paco Rabanne generally are reputable. But with Calvin Klein, it seems the entire house is trash and has always been trash since the earliest days of online discourse. So you go all the way back to the days of Badger and Blade, Base Notes first started out, you know, Facebook, into the birth of Fragrantica, and then the modern era with social media, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, what have you. The general consensus amongst the online fragrance enthusiasts, at least the men, not so much the women. Women have a softer opinion of the house, but men all seem to universally pan Calvin Klein. However, I find this only to be true among the enthusiasts, among the terminally online folks who should probably go out and touch grass, right? Breathe some fresh air. A little oxygen and sunlight will do you good. It works for plants, right? It'll work for you too. So I find if you take the vocal minority out of the equation, which is the online fragrance community, and you blow up to the macro view, and you look at how Calvin Klein in general is perceived, well, the whole thing changes then, right? Well-loved brand, reputable brand, sells really well in Macy's. A lot of iconic fragrances. People love Eternity even today. It's approaching 40 years old. People still love it. Okay, CK1 still going strong. All right. So it just seems to be that once you put in the little slice of the pie that involves the online fragrance community, we're all sitting here in our little corner with our little laptops and computers being all salty and angry about this brand. But the larger picture shows it is anything but trash. Why is that? Why would the majority of online fragrance enthusiasts be wrong about a brand that does so well and is so iconic, right? So I know for some people that might seem counterintuitive. Well, the majority can't be wrong. If the majority opinion is thus, then that's the right one to have. But no, because the majority of us is the minority of everyone else. That's what I'm trying to say here, guys. Why is it? What about Calvin Klein seems to get so much ire from your typical enthusiast, right? Not the average person. Let's delve into that a little bit. But before we do that, let's talk about the history, right? You want to know how Calvin Klein got to where it is. Well, first things first, Calvin Klein started off very small. 1968 is when the actual Calvin Klein house itself was founded. So Calvin Klein himself is really old. I'm surprised he's hanging on. I mean, he's going to be George Burns pretty soon, right? Topping a century old, but he's still around. Granted, he's not designing clothes anymore in his antediluvian age, but he is definitely alive, right? And he's had a few starring roles in sitcoms and stuff, so he's got a little bit of screen time too. Not as much as Tom Ford, but he's got a little screen time, all right? So he got his start, much like Ralph Lauren did in New York City, making suits, making sartorial wear. That's where Calvin Klein got started. He was a tailor. Most American fashion designers began as tailors, or if not tailors, as people who made clothes for other designers and then moved up into their own. Tom Ford, also an American designer, same thing. Began doing ready-to-wear clothes for Gucci. That was his big break. And then he moved up as designer for Gucci. He got promoted up. So same sort of thing. Calvin Klein, Ralph Lauren were both tailors who did stuff on occasion for other houses, and then their work got buzzed, and next thing you know, they have their own house. It wouldn't be until 1979, though, that the first Calvin Klein perfume would launch. And originally it was done just as like a one-off, because in those days, a lot of designers didn't really need perfume lines. The big houses had perfume lines, obviously, Chanel, Dior, Hermes, all the French ones. Some of the Italian ones, too, had perfume lines, but most of your little B and C tier list brands, which Calvin Klein was definitely a B, C, or tier list brand back then, didn't really need a perfume range. But it was cool to have a perfume, just to say you had one, right? So you do a little one-off thing here or there. And Calvin Klein hooked up with a company called Minnetonka, spelled Minnetonka, Minnetonka, okay? And Minnetonka spun off the eponymous Calvin Klein fragrance for women in 1979. It is probably the rarest, most obscure Calvin Klein. It is literally just called Calvin Klein. And when you Google it, it's a nightmare because you're Googling Calvin Klein perfume without any name attached to it. So you get all these other things, right? You have to drill down to Calvin Klein perfume, original, vintage, Minnetonka, 1979. You got to put all these keywords before it starts to pull up. And then when it does, it's like $45,000 goddamn dollars for like 1 ounce. So you're not going to have a bottle anyway, unless you're JJ or something and, you know, spend all your lunch money on perfume. Love you, JJ. Just got to throw a little shade on you there. But unless you're someone like that, you're not going to have that fragrance. But it exists, or it at least existed at some point. And, well, it was your typical aldehyde floral, right? That's how that works when you're, you know, making a one-off fragrance. You just do something very typical. And then the men's fragrance appeared a couple years later in 1981. By this point, Calvin Klein Cosmetics, or CKCC, Calvin Klein Cosmetics Corporation, became a real thing. They began doing lipstick, they began doing makeup, they began doing skincare. So, of course, Calvin himself wanted his own signature fragrance. Why not? All the designers had their own signature flagship men's fragrance because most designers were men in those days. So he had to have his own little thing, his own little version of, you know, eau de vetiver like Hubert de Givenchy had, or his own little version of eau de Guerlain or whatever, something that he wore for himself. And that fragrance became Calvin, which saw public release a few years later in 1981. Again, kind of conventional, right? Nothing super special about it. It had a very futuristic bottle because, see, that's Calvin Klein has always been Calvin Klein. Got to have the Barbarella, got to have the Flash Gordon, got to have the Logan's Run, got to have that edgy 70s, early 80s wedge-shaped car, you know, Lamborghini looking. Everything's got to be futuristic. Slightly curved over, but flat, geometric, right? Like it was done on an 80s computer. Like you designed the bottle on like a Commodore 64, right? You designed the fragrance in a Commodore 64 computer, and that's the bottle you get. And that's how Calvin looked. The smell, though, was pretty much musky, aromatic, fougere with some castoreum elements in it. No civet. It wasn't like a piss bomb. Sorry, guys. Calvin Klein has never made a piss bomb. If you're one of those guys that has to have piss bombs, like your typical Coros Furio kind of thing, I love them too, but Calvin Klein is not the house for you. They've never made one of those. Even that one fragrance, it's a different musk profile. It actually is a bit castoreum-y, Tonkatone-ish. My previous video where I was mentioning Italian fragrances, right? I would say Calvin is very close to Enrico Coveri. And because Enrico Coveri is much less expensive, even though it's discontinued, it's much less expensive and much easier to find. Just get Enrico Coveri. Don't spend all your lunch money and get a bottle of Calvin, unless you're JJ. Then of course then you can. But you know, otherwise don't do that, because I'm telling you, it's just an okay fragrance. It's just okay, right? But a lot of people in the fragrance community, and these people aren't my friend, so I'm not going to name drop them. I only name drop friends on my channel. But these people who I won't name like to hype up this fragrance, this Calvin fragrance, and turn it into Godhead. saying that it's the only good one. It's the only good proper one they ever made. Everything else was crap after that. And that to me just sounds like one of those stupid like rock fans or metal fans that says only the first album. Man, only the first Boston record is any good. All the rest are trash, you know. Only the original Chicago Transit Authority record is any good. Only the original Led Zeppelin, only the first Black Sabbath. Everything else is garbage. And I'm like, okay, so you're just going to discredit like the next 30, 40 years of an artist's career because you're stuck in 1970 whatever. Go fuck off, right? So that's my opinion about Calvin. Don't do that. Just don't be that person. No one likes that guy, and no one's going to like you if you become that guy. So anyway, Minnetonka kept going with Calvin Klein, obviously. But, you know, not a whole lot happened. I mean, they had Obsession in 85 and 86. And Obsession is a really great fragrance, but it was basically a great fragrance by accident. Since the whole point of the fragrance was Calvin Klein was making a perfume for his wife. You know, and I think her name was Mary Klein. And it's spelled M-A-I-R-E, so it's Mary, I think. But anyhow, he was making a fragrance for his wife, and she liked the big ambery, you know, nay oriental style. So she liked things like opium, and she liked cinnabar, and she liked taboo, and that whole thing. That's what she was into. So he kind of made a more futuristic, shinier, smoother version of that. Jean Guichard actually created that perfume. And Jean Guichard made probably one of the ultimate 80s oriental styles, right? Amber style of perfume. But he also noticed a lot of guys liked it. He liked it himself. He thought it smelled good. But just couldn't get around the fact that it was made for women, right? He wasn't going to wear it himself. He was one of those guys that had that sort of like, guys only wear cologne, right? That sort of thing. So he couldn't get Jean Guichard to make a men's version. He had already moved on to another assignment. So he pulled up some other like lesser known sort of side guy named Bob Slattery, who was more of a lab assistant, right? Didn't really make perfumes, didn't really sign briefs. But he was like, okay, I can do you a quick and dirty, and I can readjust some levels here. And he would readjust Obsession, dial up the lavender, dial down the spices, dial up the resins, and also like double, triple, quadruple down on the linalool. The linalool is what gives it that really smooth, soapy, lavendery, like I call like linalool like polish. The linalool makes a like a shiny metal sphere. So like the thing from Phantasm with the blades that comes and just, you know, drills your brain out. That's basically what linalool does. Linalool is that ball flying at you, coming to drill your brain out. And that's what he did. He put that in the Obsession. And then the big tall man's like, boy, like this, coming after you because you're wearing the perfume instead of the cologne or whatever. See what I did there with the play on words? But anyhow, so there's no cologne, by the way, in Obsession. I'm just making a joke. But the men's version came out in 86, and it was very, very much similar, samey, almost indistinguishable from the women's version. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was that it said for men on the bottle. That's what sold it. And so many guys beat on that Obsession, right? They beat on it. It became like one of those serial dating kind of fragrances for the guy that thinks he's too cool for school. Finger guns, you know, that finger gun guy that everybody knows. Hey, right? That guy. That's the guy who wore Obsession for Men back in the 80s. Hey, I got the finger guns. I must be cool. Can I get your number? No? Maybe I come back by 5 minutes from now. You'll change your mind? Yeah? Okay, cool. Finger guns. All right, that's Obsession for Men. So around this time, Calvin Klein as a brand began to really blow up, right? So Minnetonka was a small operation. They weren't really, the economy of scale wasn't really there. So for the next leap, Calvin Klein would decide to get a bit serious and would sell the CKCC house, the Calvin Klein Cosmetics Corporation, to Unilever. Unilever, big giant company, right? Unilever responsible for soaps and all kinds of stuff. So Unilever would pick up Calvin Klein Cosmetics Corporation in 1989, right? Just in time to release a little fragrance for men called Eternity for Men that same year. Now, the women's version of Eternity had come out 2 years earlier. It was composed by Sophia Grosjean. She put her little Hug Me Accord in that, so classic women's aldehyde fragrance in '87. But the men's version, which was a Carlos Benem composition, 1989, Unilever distributed that fragrance. That was the real thing that just broke Calvin Klein into the big leagues. I mean, Obsession was good, but it was Eternity that lived up to its name. The fragrance still sells now after so many years, so it truly is Eternity, right? In the men's version, it more or less reinvented the fougere as we know it, and I cannot stress enough how important that is. And I know a lot of you guys who hate Calvin Klein, again, they're trash. All this stuff's trash. You guys don't care. But I'm saying, if not for Calvin Klein Eternity, there would have been no Paco Rabanne Excess. There would have been no Chanel Platinum Egoist. There would have been no Curve for Men by Liz Claiborne. There would have been no Creed Himalaya in 2002. There would have been none of those fresh fougères that all of y'all do like and all of y'all do wear, even stuff like Percival by Parfum de Marly. Eternity walked so fragrances like Percival could run. So, like it or hate it, you got to respect it, okay? That's all I'm saying. Now, Eternity for Men was also co-designed by a woman named Anne Gotlieb. And her name is very important because Anne Gotlieb and Associates is a third-party firm that basically specializes in being a creative consultant, a creative director, if you will, for houses that don't have their own internal evaluators, like L'Oreal or whoever. So if you don't have an evaluator, you don't have a creative director, you can hire Anne Gotlieb herself or someone in her firm to step in and be that for you. She did it for Avon. She did it for Calvin Klein most famously. And a lot of the fragrances that are now their biggest hits, stuff like CK1, stuff like Escape, like Eternity, all the way through to the 2000s, stuff like Truth and Euphoria, okay? She helped create all those. And she sat in and smelled the mods, chose the mods, had the fragrances altered. She was there for that. So you can attribute at least half of the success to both the perfumer and to her on the creative direction side. Eventually, the two parted ways. And once the two parted ways, Calvin Klein fragrances began getting a little weird. They were already kind of weird, but they got a little more weird when she left, right? We'll touch upon that real briefly because I don't want this video to be too long. But it leads me to why I think a lot of people don't really appreciate Calvin Klein in the online fragrance community. And that's they tend to check all the wrong boxes in the wrong order. Any individual box checked by itself in another brand would be fine. But all combined together, as they are with Calvin Klein, makes a big no for a lot of us hipsters and a lot of us nerds and snobs and self-appointed connoisseurs and tastemakers, all of us, pinkies out type people. We can't handle all these things together in one pot. It's like when you go to 7-Eleven and you mix all the Slurpee flavors together into one Slurpee and mix it all up. Looks like a clown wig. We can't handle that, okay? So basically what you got is, you got avant-garde packaging and titles. That's okay. We've got plenty of niche brands who do that. We've got very abstract, futuristic, and fantasy-style fragrance notes like Rain Accord, right? Frosted Papaya or whatever. Again, that stuff in a niche house is okay. High price point, small market, someone likes it, someone's willing to pay that money for it, okay? Then we have the fact that all the fragrances are still, in spite of these high concept, high art things, are still trying to be mainstream, right? And again, we like our mainstream fragrances, we like our blue juices, we like our gourmands, we like our fruity florals, but typically we have an expectation that those fragrances are not going to be weird, They're going to be commercial and mass appealing, but not weird. And then lastly, it's the price point. You can do something very synthetic and very avant-garde and charge $300 for it, like Francis Kurkdjian does, right? With MFK and all those fragrances. You can charge a high price for that weirdness. Ganymede, right? Same sort of thing. You can do that because that's a niche market, that's a limited market, and those people are willing to roll the dice on that stuff. But you bring that kind of avant-garde futurism, that kind of weird packaging, the weird nomenclature, and then you try to sell it at a mass price point with a mass appeal spin to the fragrance, and it's just like, you're gone, okay? We just want no parts of it. And that's the thing. Each of those concepts individually, taken by themselves, can be okay. When you combine them all together, high concept, high art, mass appeal, low price point. It's a recipe for cognitive dissonance. And what is it about cognitive dissonance? I've already made that video. You already know. We are in conflict with ourselves. We can't have high art, high concept, and mass appeal and cheap in the same fragrance. We just can't do it. And thus, a lot of these things that came out over the years, since CK1, we've had contradiction, we've had truth, we've had crave, we've had euphoria, okay, encounter, all these different ones. We've had reveal, really weird fragrance. You know, I could almost do a second video. In fact, I will do a second video of the weirdest Calvin Klein fragrances, a separate video where I can give justice to these weirder, stranger, more avant-garde, artsy, mass appeal, you know, fragrances and the funky bottles. I'll do like an unlist of Calvin Klein fragrances where I give each one of them more space, more room to breathe. But let's just say that people in the online fragrance community can't seem to mix these two things together. They don't want their peas and their carrots together. They want the peas over here, and they want the carrots over here. And that's why Calvin Klein, in my opinion, gets flunked out so often, because they're trying to give you high concept, high art with a mass appeal scent, and then also not charge you $400 for the privilege, right? And that just seems to break people's minds. They can't handle that. Now, the thing is, I feel like with Anne Gotlieb out of the picture, all the fragrances made under her watch were really timeless. Like I said, people generally, even collectors and enthusiasts, people generally like CK1. They generally like Eternity, Obsession, Escape, right? Generally speaking. Once you get past her tenure into the mid to late 2000s, when Unilever actually stepped away and Coty took over, because Philip Van Heusen actually bought Calvin Klein. And when Philip Van Heusen bought Calvin Klein, they switched out Unilever for Coty, because I guess Coty gave him a better deal. Then the plot began to get a little bit lost, and we saw all these seasonal flankers. Summer every year, new CK1. Summer every year, a new version of Eternity. All these endless air and aqua and fire and water and now and then and past and future and all these crazy flanker after flanker after flanker on all these Calvin Klein releases, because Coty just beats it like it owes it money, right? And the plot got lost. And a lot of that is justified hate. That you do a lot of that, you're going to get people going, well, why should I bother? Every time I turn around and buy something, they're just going to discontinue the one I had and replace it with the same thing the following year with a little twist on it, and it gets annoying after a while. So I get it, I really do. But there's still a lot of good in there. Just, you're never getting past the weird bottles. That's the thing. Calvin Klein's always going to give you that. So, all right, guys, that's been a rundown on Calvin Klein, the brand. And next up, I will do a video about their fragrances individually. This has been the On List. Thanks for watching.